Hi, Judith.
Hey, Bob. How are you?
I'm doing fine. How are you?
Good.
Good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV. This is The Wright Show. And you are Judith Shulevitz.
I am.
Who recently made a splash with a big piece on the front of the New York Times Sunday Review that skyrocketed to the top of the most emailed list. And that's what we're going to talk about today. But first, by way of further introduction, you wrote a book about Shabbat.
The Sabbath.
The Sabbath, sorry, I didn't mean to be parochial.
I must insist on the Sabbath.
It's an ecumenical kind of Sabbath thing.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. And what's the exact title?
The Sabbath World, Glimpses of a Different Order of Time. And it's a kind of cultural history of the idea of a socially organized period of non-work, which is called the Sabbath, but doesn't have to be a religious idea. In America, for 50 years or so, according to Felix Frankfurter, Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, it was not a religious idea. Thus, it did not violate the First Amendment. That was his defense of blue laws. It failed, but anyway.
And it sounds like something that we are more in need of than ever today in our 24/7 world, Judith.
Yes. Everyone should read my book because it defends the idea that you should set aside time and make sure that the people who are important to you in your life set aside time to not work at the same time.
I support this initiative.
Excellent.
Also, you have an actual affiliation with the New York Times, I gather, right? You're like an official opinion contributor or something as a title?
Yeah, something like that. They just hired 20 people. I think it's down to 19 because something didn't work out. But anyway, they hired 20 people to become regular contributors. Not columnists, just regular contributors.
Yeah. Didn't work out is kind of a euphemism there. There was a minor controversy over that one, but we'll let it pass.
Yeah.
Now, the piece you wrote in the Sunday Review was called In College and Hiding from Scary Ideas. Now, am I accurately summarizing its thesis as being that whereas your generation was tough, today's college kids are a bunch of little weenies?
No, that's not.
I misunderstood.
You misunderstood.
Okay, well, you tell me then.
I don't think we were tough. I think it didn't occur to us to object to speech we didn't like on the grounds that we were vulnerable and that made us feel threatened. I think that's just a language that has, or vocabulary that has seeped into student culture and maybe other cultures as well. And it wouldn't have occurred to us. When we, in my generation and in your generation, I mean, I didn't do this, I don't know if you did this, but if people wanted to object to someone coming on campus and speaking, we'd say their views are politically unacceptable. They are outside the bounds of acceptable discourse, and we don't want them on our campus. Now it's sort of flipped around and says their views will be damaging or triggering to me. So I just think that's an odd shift.
And the phrase "safe space" is comes up often. That was a recurring thing in your piece.
So I wanted to take the piece from telling people about these safe spaces which are prevalent on campus and showing how the rhetoric of safety has sort of leaked out of the safe space and kind of taken over the whole conversation. So I don't have a problem with safe spaces per se. They, their history has been traced to the feminist consciousness raising movement, to the early days of the gay and lesbian movement. I think there's a social and political value to having like-minded people who need to discuss their identity and all kinds of complicated things get together in a group in which certain forms of conversation like criticism and ridicule are forbidden. That's cool. That seems like a good idea. There was just a piece in Tablet about some gay and lesbian students at Yeshiva University, an Orthodox university, who have formed a safe space. You can imagine that they would need it there. It's tough to be gay and lesbian at Yeshiva University. So I have no problem with that. The problem I have is with the way it sort of spreads and becomes something that people start thinking that campuses themselves should be safe spaces. They should be spaces free of criticism, free of ridicule, free of the kind of speech we think needs protecting, even if we don't necessarily agree with it.
Okay. So, and I should say I'm a little less alarmed by this than you seem. So this will be the perspective from which I push back a little, or at least play devil's advocate.
Okay.
But let's start with the first kind of example of a safe space. It was at Brown, and there was going to be a debate, I guess, about whether rape culture dominates, or whether is this thing called rape culture, something or other, that some people were going to find offensive, perhaps, and so somebody created a safe space for them to retreat to if they found the debate offensive or something.
Yeah. So the debate was on a wide range of things, but somebody discovered that one of the debaters, a libertarian, she calls herself a libertarian feminist, her name is Wendy McElroy, had written that she doesn't believe rape culture exists in Western cultures. Her argument is, in the West, rape is outlawed, it is criminalized. If you're caught doing it, you are punished. That is not a culture that sanctions rape. Where you have rape culture is in places like Afghanistan, where a woman who, lets herself get raped can be arrested or murdered with impunity. That is a rape culture. So she wanted to argue, she does argue, that there isn't such a thing as rape culture in America. Mm-hmm. Now, some women on something called the Sexual Assault Task Force found this objectionable, wrote the president, got a meeting with administrators, and got the president to send out an email announcing that there was going to be a simultaneous competing event defending the idea that there is a rape culture, and there would be a safe space set up. And in the safe space, the president had nothing to do with setting up the safe space. That was sort of handed over to student volunteers. And in the safe space, they had various things that were supposed to calm down any sexual assault victim who had been triggered or traumatized by the debate. And they had things like Play-Doh, bubbles, coloring books, cookies, and video of frolicking puppies. And I thought this was just this was infantilizing. This was kindergarten. This was taking the idea of the safe space to a really ridiculous place.
I don't know. I mean, if I was in college, I would have certainly welcomed the free cookies. So she said like a couple of dozen people showed up by her count.
Yeah.
Generally, people inflate their crowd estimates, so we got to figure that's an outer limit. I guess, well, part of my reaction is, first of all, kind of what harm was done by the safe space. So some people go there. It's not like they tried to prevent the person from talking. I guess the competing event is almost more an attempt to keep people from hearing the allegedly offensive presentation. But even there, I'm not that worried so far. If 24 Brown students go and eat cookies, which I would think at Brown, it's not that uncommon. Some of them maybe had the munchies, and but the other thing that I notice about this is, I guess my big question is, how broad a spectrum does this phenomenon cover, right? It's not, I didn't see any examples like, well, somebody came to debate economic philosophy, and because they were too right-wing or too left-wing, they needed a safe space, or somebody was debating foreign policy. It seems to me that all of the examples affect kind of specific interest groups, some ethnic groups, or in this case, actual rape survivors. The woman you quoted, the Brown student you quoted, is saying that she needed that safe space, was herself a rape survivor.
Right, one of them. I quoted two, but yeah, one
okay. Of them. And so that seems to me like, I especially think with something like a rape survivor, it's like, who am I to judge? It's I'm sure it's quite traumatic. Now you might ask, why doesn't she just skip the talk? Right. Rather than, maybe a safe space is overkill, but still the idea, your thesis is kind of, damn it, kids need to be exposed to the ideas that trouble them the most. It's good for you. They shouldn't hide for them. And I would say that at least in this case, a victim of actual trauma, and maybe I'd say the same thing of a returning, military vet, if there's a certain thing they don't want to confront, I don't feel I'm in a position to tell them to buck up,
I disagree. I think that the idea, well, like I said, I have no problem with safe spaces per se. This was an example of one gone, I thought, to a point that pointed something out, which is that there's something infantilizing going on here. But what I object to is the rhetoric of safe space sort of spreading out. So I give an example of something that happened at Columbia, where a group called Everyone Allied Against Homophobia decided to slip a flyer under the door of every dorm room at Columbia, which said, "This is a safe space." And in the text underneath it, it said, "Please tape this to your window or your door." And a lot of people did. And someone else, another student said to himself, he read this and he said, "I don't want my room to be a safe space. I want it to be a dangerous space." So he wrote a vigorous defense of dangerous spaces and published it in the Columbia Spectator. Now, you might say this is an example of a wonderful conversation about what kind of speech should be on campus. But I think these things have a chilling effect. And you also asked about, how do I quantify this? How widespread a phenomenon is this? And the answer is I don't know how to quantify it because it's atmospheric. I have tons of examples. But the thing is that the anecdotes themselves are chilling, I think, to people who want to pipe up with unpopular ideas, whether they're students or faculty. So knowing that you could be accused of having threatened or triggered or made someone feel unsafe, I think gives you pause before you say something you think might be unpopular. Like, there is no rape culture in the West. The rape culture exists in places where women get murdered for being raped.
Okay, but in this case, in the Columbia case, I mean, first of all, I'd say, again, and by the way, when I said I wonder how broad the phenomenon is, I don't mean how many times it happens per month on the average campus. I mean, how broad a spectrum of subjects does it cover? Yeah. And again, the Columbia thing involves a kind of an interest group, gay people, who rightly feel that in the past they've been persecuted. And so again, this is kind of subject specific in that sense. It seems to me, well, let me address this one first. I wasn't so troubled. It seems to me, okay, so they're slipping these flyers under the door saying, kind of sign on to this if you want this to be a safe space. Now, I took that to mean a safe space in terms of this being a campus where you're allowed to be gay without being ridiculed, without being persecuted. That seems to me okay. And having students put this on their door was maybe a little more demonstrative than asking them to sign a petition. But I don't, in other words, I'm not clear exactly what bothered you about that example. If all they're saying is, don't we, honk your horn if you agree that we should not denounce gay people on this campus. That's what I saw this as kind of being. And I'm fine with the other guy putting a sign on his door that says this is a dangerous space, but I didn't find the thing he was reacting to so threatening to speech, to robust speech.
Well, robust speech is not the kind of thing you necessarily want to hear, but it's not necessarily persecutorial, right, or insulting. So what if you wanted to come into somebody's room and say, frankly, my religion makes me oppose gay marriage? If everybody on the campus or a lot of people on campus had these signs up in their window, you would think, that is not something I'm going to come out and say, which I think is a shame. I mean, I am for gay marriage, but I'm also, I think, more than I'm for gay marriage, I'm for the principle that people have the right to oppose gay marriage.
Yeah, I mean, it's a funny thing how these things change over time, though. And with race, there are things that respected people said 80 years ago in America about separate but equal and so on, and now you would call them racist. So I hadn't really thought of the gay marriage example. Okay, that makes it a little more complicated. Other examples, and I think the other examples you bring up involve ethnic groups in one sense or another, racial, religious. So there's the N-word example where Wendy Kaminer. Will you tell us that one?
So Wendy Kaminer was at a Smith alumni event. She was on a panel, And they were actually discussing free speech. And so she was making the case that the N-word euphemisms should not be used when teaching texts that use slang, language we would not use today. So, for example, nigger in Huck Finn or in teaching American history. And nothing happened on the panel. Everyone sort of went on about their business because it was clear she was talking about race, right? Afterward, somebody published a transcript of the discussion in the Smith newspaper with a trigger warning on top, and all of the words that people had used to talk about what words were unacceptable bleeped out. For example, the word crazy was replaced with ableist slur, and of course, the word Wendy used with the N-word. And there was this hue and cry on campus, and the president, who had been on the panel, had to apologize for not having spoken up on the panel to object to Wendy Kaminer using this word. And I quote Wendy saying, "It's amazing to me that they can't distinguish between racist speech and speech about racist speech."
Okay, and it's kind of amazing to me that she doesn't quite get what I think is going on here. So let me tell you what I think that is. And by the way, I guess if the president of Smith got in trouble for not apologizing, I should apologize for your having just used the actual N-word rather than one time saying the N-word. You are the first white person to ever say that on Blogging Heads TV, I think. Glenn Lowry said it, and that points to what I think, to the whole, the subtleties governing that word in America. Now, the way I see, and it's true that by and large, and I would think Wendy Kaminer knew this, by and large, there's a kind of a taboo on white people using that word, even in quoting someone else, even using it not approvingly, right? That's the kind of official code. And I have always taken that to be almost... it's almost like the semantic equivalent of reparations, right? It's like it's a taboo that's meant to emphasize how bad white America should feel about slavery and discrimination or something, but it underscores. It's an acknowledgement of the magnitude of the crime in some sense, or it's, in some, an anthropologist, I'm sure, can point to all kinds of societies where saying certain words are taboo. Now, maybe usually that's because they think that some god is going to smite you down or something, but I think it also reflects something about the society's values. And I've always taken this to just be that. It may seem crazy that that you're not even allowed to quote disapprovingly the word, but I've always thought that kind of having to go through that circumlocution is an expression of, it's an acknowledgement of the sensitivity and the legitimacy of the grievance, and on and on and on. And it's hard for me to believe that Wendy Kaminer didn't know that, and she's like mystified and going like, I don't get it. You mean you're not allowed? Well, right, Wendy, where have you been for the last 5 decades? Exactly. That's the deal. Now, she may object to it, but it doesn't, again, it's like, what, is that posing some actual threat to vigorous discussion, that particular rule?
Yes, I think it is. I think it's context dependent. I think that if you were teaching Huck, imagine yourself in a classroom and you have to teach Huck Finn, right? And one of the big issues, the big elephant in the room about Huck Finn is the use of that word, right? It's used derogatorily, it's used fondly, it's used neutrally. It's part of the vocabulary of Mark Twain's time. And it's got to be discussed because every student in the room is going to have a reaction to it. Now, as
you could discuss it using the phrase N-word, and Wendy Kaminer could have discussed it using the phrase N-word. That's my point. I'm not necessarily advocating that you go through Huckleberry Finn and replace that word with N-word every time. I'm not really addressing that issue, but I'm just saying, suppose you had a class discussion where you use the word N-word by prior agreement. I don't see how that inhibits discussion of the issue.
Well, it takes away the charge from the word. It takes away the pedagogical experience of sort of handling the word. I think there is a kind of force that words like that have. It's almost magical. And you have to address it. I think that there are contexts in which you do have to address it. There are also situations on campuses where there have been two people talking, one white, one black, another situation where two black people were talking and they used that word and they were actually censured by the university for using that word between themselves. So even consensual use of the word in a small group can get you in trouble on some campuses. So I think, it's a word in use. It's a word in current use, not just in Huck Finn and in 19th century texts and 19th century history. To not be able to say it in a context in which you're talking about the word itself, I think is intellectually dishonest. I think there's all kinds of
where's the dishonesty?
You're not. First of all, Wendy's point was when you say the N-word, we all know what you're thinking, right? So why not just say it?
And it is out of deference to the sensibility of African Americans. That is the answer. Most of them would prefer you didn't say it. And I've never been in their shoes. I don't know what it's like to grow up knowing that every time I walk in a drugstore, they're going to look at me especially closely because they think I'm going to steal something or whatever else. I haven't had their experience. I certainly am not part of an ethnic group that has had their historical experience in America. And the answer to that question is, it is out of deference to their sensibilities. And by the way, in the United States, I think this is generally the way we handle it. If we think that there is a group that has been subject to persecution, has been marginalized, and so there's going to be some kind of adjustment to the speech code in deference to them, we kind of let them define it. Maybe sometimes it seems silly. I mean, I lived through the period when the word colored became illegitimate. I mean, remember, the NAACP was National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, so it was once an approved term among black people. And then that went out of vogue, and then you may be too young to remember the Afro-American phase.
No.
It was more efficient, fewer syllables than African-American, but for whatever reason, that fell out of, and so on. It's like, my feeling is it really doesn't take exact much of a cost on me if you, in general, let the ethnic group, if it does start to impede actual discourse, I guess I'd have a problem. But I don't think blacks are the only ethnic group we do that with.
No, they're not. And one of the questions is, over time, how do you define which group is persecuted? And another question is, it's one thing to sort of socially agree that we should use certain euphemisms. It's another thing for people to actually get in trouble, which is what hate speech codes are about, which is why I oppose hate speech codes as well. It's another thing to actually sort of create a situation in which somebody can have something put on their record, could lose employment for using the word, in a non-insulting, non-fighting word kind of way. I mean, there are certain kinds of speech which are prohibited by the First Amendment. There are, universities have the right to maintain civility in their classrooms. But I think that, there are people who are going to use it not necessarily in a malicious way and are going to get in trouble. And I think that has a dampening effect on discourse. And it's not just on that word, but on saying anything that might offend anybody who has been defined historically or defines themselves as oppressed.
Okay, but your piece does say that by and large, kind of the people you're focusing on are not asking for a tightening of hate speech codes. You said there's not much of a call for. This is something different than a call for censorship. You said you're talking about. You said there is some call for more sensitivity training and stuff, but by and large, you're talking about people who are creating a safe haven for people who don't want to hear something, or people who in responding to speech emphasize how it offended their sensibilities rather than saying I disagree with it or something, right? I mean, by your own account, you're not mainly in this piece talking about people actually, tightening legal codes or university official speech codes or anything like that, right?
No, I mean, because a lot of this stuff already exists, right? A great number of campuses, I'd say probably the majority of campuses now have hate speech codes. And they have Title VI, Title VII, and Title IX, which they have to conform to, which prohibits the campuses from creating a hostile environment. So one of the arguments I make in the piece is that the language of trauma and the language of vulnerability, unsafeness, feeling threatened, emerged in part to respond to Title VI, Title VII, and Title IX. In other words, if someone is feeling threatened, then that could be a violation of Title VI, Title VII, and Title IX, and that is a way to get the administration's attention. Probably more than invoking for censorship or hate speech codes, because everybody feels quite ambivalent. Administrations tend to feel ambivalent about those, but they definitely do not want to lose their federal funding, which they can do if the government finds that they violated these amendments to the Civil Rights Act.
Right.
So I'm saying there's this language of vulnerability, which I think is unhealthy, and I think chills open, vigorous, robust discourse. And I'll just give you an example from my own life. I taught an essay writing class at Barnard in the spring of last year, and I had as sort of the culminating essay on my syllabus quite a wonderful essay that appeared in N+1, written by a young woman about the making of a pornographic movie in San Francisco and how it caused her to start to rethink some of the sexual mores of her own clique of friends, mm-hmm. the world she moved in. It was not itself pornographic, but it did describe, some disturbing stuff. And I showed it to a friend of mine on the Barnard faculty, close friend, and she said, "Get that off there." I said, "Come on, what do you mean? It's a great essay. It's a really good essay. It will speak to these. It's written by a young woman not much older than my students. It will speak to them. We live in a world saturated with porn." And she said, "You could be accused of triggering." Now, Barnard didn't censor me. My friend was not censoring me. Mm-hmm. She was a tenured faculty member giving a lowly adjunct some good advice, and I took it, and I took it off. Now, had I been the true free speech warrior that I wish I were, I would have left it on and let the chips fall where they may. But I think a lot of faculty, and I've been told this by a lot of faculty members, and I've gotten a lot of letters, and I've spoken to a lot of people. I spoke to a lot of people before I did the piece, say they worry that they will be accused of offending somebody, making somebody feel unsafe, triggering, and so on. And I think the trigger warning also, which is something I talk about in this piece, sort of highlights the idea that certain things are so disturbing that you may want to check out of the class. You may want to leave the class at this point. You may want to ask permission not to read this particular text, and sort of creates this atmosphere in which we think, well, things must be so disturbing we can't even deal with them. And I think that's unhealthy.
What's interesting is that probably that same essay or an essay having the same stuff in it 60 years ago would never have shown up at Barnard either.
Yeah.
Because then there was just a very generally conservative value system. Right. And my point is just that there have always been speech codes, and they evolve over time, and this isn't like a qualitatively new thing. It's maybe there was some moment in American history when there was just none of this, but I really doubt it. And the fact is, for almost all of American history, the speech code has been much more restrictive than it is now.
Right, but I think we're moving backwards. And I think your point is a good one, which is that this is a return to a kind of neo-Victorianism. We can't talk about pornography. We live in a world saturated with pornography, right? One click away on our laptops, and yet we can't talk about I at a women's college should not talk. It's not that I can't. It's not that Barnard said I can't, but I am afraid to assign a piece about the making of a pornographic film, at a women's college. So I think that's kind of sad.
You know what? As a tuition-paying father, if I hear that my daughter was in a class and at first the syllabus was going to include something about the making of a pornographic film, but then they changed it so it didn't, I'm not running down and demanding my money back.
Okay.
I think she'll probably survive that. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. and it'll leave her ill-equipped to battle the great, to engage in the great intellectual battles of our time.
I think the idea that she might be afraid to take on certain topics for fear that they will offend people, and that there's this sort of penumbra of fear that will sort of spread over topics, I think that is dangerous.
I think she should be attentive to things that might offend people. I think America's a very diverse society, and people have various kinds of issues. I happen to be in the one group that I don't think is entitled to any white males, but I understand how how certain groups certainly are. And I wanted to talk about your closing example, which brings up yet another group, and it's an ethnic group, a religious group, Muslims. It's the Charlie Hebdo thing. Right. Is it Hebdo or Ebdo? What is the official?
Well, I mean, let's see. It depends on whether you want to be, linguistically correct or not.
I want to be. I'm a reverse snob. I want to sound
Charlie Hebdo. Otherwise, you'd have to say Charlie Hebdo.
Charlie Hebdo. The Charlie Hebdo thing.
Yeah.
So there was an actual staffer from Charlie Hebdo of, I gather, Arabic descent.
Yes.
Who was giving a talk at University of Chicago. I gather, Muslim student addressed the person in Q&A, and what happened? So, I mean, one thing that's important to note is that this journalist had death threats issued against her by supporters of ISIS. So she travels with 6 armed guards. And, they had to come to the talk and protect her. And she was talking about French conceptions of religious freedom, which are different from American ones and could be offensive to an American. For example, in France, you're not allowed to wear the hijab in a public space, which is not something we in America would agree with. So the Muslim student stood up and said, she felt that the cartoons that Charlie Hebdo published were in fact anti-Muslim, and that she didn't support the phrase "Je suis Charlie," I am Charlie. Right. So the journalist, who is sort of rambunctious and difficult, as someone in her situation would be, and as someone who works at Charlie Hebdo would probably be, said, "Look, you don't have to be for Charlie. So being for Charlie means being willing to die for a drawing, and you don't have the balls to die for a drawing." I couldn't say balls in the New York Times. I said gut. Yeah, I inferred that it was balls when you used gut and said, but the actual word wasn't gut. You could have called it the G word or the B word in but that could be a lot with American custom. That could be a lot of things. Now she said this to the Muslim student. She said, "You don't have the balls." No, she just said, here's what I am Charlie means. It means I have the balls to die for my drawing. And a lot of people, she didn't say you, she said a lot of people don't have the balls to die for a drawing. Okay. And she didn't, the implication possibly was that. And she said, look, I am glad that people support I am Charlie because, I live under threat. And the Muslim student said, I feel threatened too. And so then someone else wrote an editorial in the student newspaper saying that it was shocking to her that El Razzoui, the journalist, had created a space in which it was not safe to dissent. And I found that sort of startling because, if there was anyone in that room who was unsafe, under threat actually of death by a very violent group, it was El Razzoui. It was not the Muslim student. So the idea that she had created an unsafe space for dissent, for having dissented against the reign of terror that makes it difficult to publish controversial drawings, that just struck me as shocking. Well, of course, it's possible for 2 people in the room to legitimately feel threatened at the same time, right? It is possible. The way you put it is, if there was anybody, and maybe the Charlie Hebdo staffer had more reason or something, but it's and this is the way you put it in your piece. The closing line is that they The student and her defender couldn't see that it was Mrs. El-Razawi who was in need of a safer space, which may be true. Doesn't preclude the possibility that this Muslim student was too. I mean, I'm not saying that I would have used I'd have to be there to know if she had any right.
You can watch the video.
Yeah, to say, look, this was, and I take your point that the safer space language is probably being used a little less carefully than even I might like. But I would say that, again, a Muslim student is, I've never walked in those shoes, and this speaks in a way about the point she was making about Charlie Hebdo and saying, oh, I am Charlie. Mm-hmm. But I think that is related to what you're saying, and I have a minority view on that too, which is I would not say I am Charlie. I would say they had the right to publish that cartoon. Right. But my problem with I Am Charlie is I think it's ambiguous as to what I'm defending and what I'm embracing. Am I just saying they had the right to publish that, which I'm saying, or am I saying I would have published that cartoon, which I wouldn't have done because I think the cartoons were gratuitously offensive, and I understand why some Muslims would be offended. I don't see what great purpose was served. So I would not myself, if I were running a magazine, have published those cartoons. That's why I would not say I am Charlie. And that's also why I can understand why a Muslim student could plausibly think, and I think a lot of people did mean I am Charlie this way, but could plausibly think that when you say I am Charlie, you're not just saying they have the right to publish a cartoon. You're saying I like publishing a cartoon that depicts Muhammad as naked and pisses off a lot of Muslims. And I think some people were saying that. But there's an ambiguity in I Am Charlie, and one of the interpretations of it, I think, is plausibly offensive to Muslims, and so I at least understand the point that student was making as I take it.
So I take it you would be for hate speech codes on campus. You think that's fine? No,
I really think no. Here's the distinction I'm making, and Glenn Greenwald wrote a thing about this that you may have come to your attention that made this point perhaps more confrontationally than I would have made it, but there is a distinction between defending the right to say something, and I haven't even thought through hate speech codes. The answer to your question is I don't know, but as for Charlie Hebdo, there's a distinction between defending someone's right to do something and to say something and embracing the speech itself. So like when the Nazis marched through Skokie, I guess I'd be saying they have the legal right to do it, but I'm not going to the next day if one of them is killed, I'm not going to go, I am a Nazi. That's really not that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying they have the right to do it. I'm not embracing the speech, and I think saying I am a Nazi would obviously invite the interpretation that you were embracing the speech. That's all I'm saying. So the answer to your question is my point is you can be against speech codes, but in order to avoid anybody thinking you embrace a particular ethnic slur, you would not go around saying, I am Joe Smith if Joe Smith used the slur. Okay? Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. Perhaps I'm not calling for the students to not write their editorials, to not say they're unsafe. I think I would actually be more critical of the presidents who issue apologies, the presidents who create competing events, the presidents who bring down the hate speech codes upon people who do use the problematic speech. Then I would be less critical of the students. But I do feel that there is a kind of cringing, flinching attitude about problematic, difficult, controversial speech that I think is contrary to the educational purpose of a university. I think they need to learn to have robust discussions. I think you need to be able to have the discussion about why using the N-word, or the word that I was the first white person on Blogging Heads to use, is problematic, and you need to be able to say it. You need to be able to offend people, I think, in order to have a robust education. And I think there's also a problem defining who is a persecuted minority. For example, I quote this critical race theorist, a law professor named Mari Matsuda, who has written eloquently about the need to take what she calls the violence of the word off campus, because students are at a vulnerable transition point in their lives. And in this essay, she talks about whether or not it is permissible to use Zionist speech, right? Because Palestinians are a persecuted category, and Zionist speech could be racist speech. There are many people who think Zionist speech is racist speech.
So what, like calling Israel a Jewish state would be Zionist speech, or what's an example of Zionist speech?
Zionist speech would be defending, for example, the right of Israel to protect its boundaries or to invade Gaza. That might be Zionist speech. Or it could be defending the regime of Israel, which is, according to some people, an apartheid state. Mm-hmm. Now, it happens that there's an example, I think, where was it? Montclair State University, the Student Government Association actually fined a Palestinian group for putting out anti-Israel pamphlets. So who gets to be the persecuted minority? It gets complicated.
Okay, but when you say, when you worry about people, prohibiting the advocacy of or criticism of Israel doing something in Gaza, there you're talking about a prohibition, whether formal or informal, on substantive, meaningful speech. I don't think any of the examples I've given where I would be careful about what I said or what I think people should say have fallen in that category, okay? Again, I maintain that you can have the same discussion substituting N-word for the N-word that you can if you just use the word. So it doesn't, and with Charlie Hebdo, I'm trying to be clearer about the substance of what I'm saying. I'm saying the trouble with a formulation like I am Charlie is it obscures what I actually want to say. And I'm not saying people should not be allowed to say, damn it, I would have published the cartoons. Fine. I'm just saying there's a problem with the I am Charlie formulation. And in general, I think all the examples I've used here, I'm not advocating anything that would inhibit the expression of substantive positions. Okay? And when you say that people should get offended or people should, or whatever, I don't want to put words in your mouth. They can rewind the videotape and see what you said. I would point out that people getting offended is often places a great constraint on our ability to communicate about the actual substantive issues. And a deference, there's a reason that diplomats are, exquisitely attuned to this thing, because they want actual conversation to happen and they want a meeting of the minds if it's possible. And they know there's no point wasting time insulting somebody. And that's kind of my position.
I think it's a fine position to have. I agree with you in some cases and not in others. I think you're right about the ambiguity of I am Charlie. I don't think that's the point of the example. I think the point of the example is to have a war of who is more threatened, and then have an editorial saying that this woman was in a relative position of power, which the editorialist said, and she failed to create a safe space for dissent. I think it's wussy. I think it's.
So you do think it's a generation of weenies? Then I was right at the beginning.
I didn't say it was a generation. I said it's a few examples, and it creates a chilling atmosphere on speech. I don't think we should be training our students to be diplomats, and I think you have the right to your opinion. I have the right to my opinion. But if people go around saying your opinion threatens me, then it's going to have a chilling effect. I'm sorry that I, as a 19-year-old, don't have the diplomatic language that I probably should have. Mm-hmm. But if I can't even bring out my opinions and learn how to refine them and learn how to say them in the proper way, I'm never going to learn that. I'm never going to have the conversation. I'm just not going to trot out my opinions. And I think campuses should actually be a safe space for rigorous, vigorous debate, rather than a place where you're constantly sort of tiptoeing around controversial issues and you don't even necessarily know what they're going to be. As in the case of is Zionist speech racist speech, or is anti-Zionist speech racist speech? That's an issue in which you don't know what you're supposed to say. So any reasonable student would just say, or even faculty member, I'm not going to touch that one.
Okay, I would say that you said that all the, in the University of Chicago case, they were just kind of arguing over who had more of the right to be threatened. Okay, but they both had kind of prior claims that fed into that. And the claim of the Muslim student, I think, was that if somebody is saying, I embrace that naked picture of Muhammad that, let's face it, was just almost designed to provoke, and I think provoke not in the good sense of the word, but to piss people off. If she says, I am offended by that, I think that's a claim I take seriously. I mean, again, I've never been a Muslim, but I think it's got to be kind of an uncomfortable time to be one. And because there are a lot of Americans, I mean, some poll, like 25% of Americans think that ISIS is an accurate reflection of what Islam is. And my previous blogging heads was a debate with a guy who wrote the Atlantic ISIS piece about whether he was really had grounds for saying ISIS is, quote, very Islamic. And the reason I said that is because I think the reason I challenged that and said you should be very careful about those phrases, use them if they're defensible, but be very careful, precisely because there are Muslims in America and elsewhere who feel that people are looking at them this way, and there are bigots in America who are looking at them that way. And that's me. I'm like that.
Well, I think what I'm arguing is that this leads to actual censorship. This attitude of being very quick to take offense, to feel threatened, to use this language which quickly invokes these, Title VI, Title VII, Title IX, and makes administration scared. I think it brings on censoriousness, and so you have this rash of disinvitations. And an organization called the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education has shown that the number of actual disinvitations, invitations in which, for example, as happened at Smith recently, in which somebody is invited, there's an uproar on campus and she just decides, hey, I'm not going to go, or people coming to speak and being silenced by what's called the heckler's veto. This has quadrupled since 2000. You have, an example in my piece was Laura Kipnis, a professor at Northwestern University, wrote an essay in the Chronicle of Higher Ed criticizing the atmosphere of sexual paranoia or neo-Victorianism on campus, and students protested, saying that she had traumatized them, that her words were triggering, and called upon the administration to condemn the essay. Now, Morton Shapiro, the president of Northwestern, actually published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal saying, affirming his commitment to free speech. But I think the idea that they're calling on the administration to condemn this when she just was talking about the generational differences, I think it's a slippery slope. I think it's going to go bad places.
Although, again, there has always been the slope, and we've always been somewhere on it. I mean, the Glenn Greenwald piece I alluded to in the context of Charlie Hebdo, what he did, and I wouldn't have done it this way, but he posted a bunch of anti-Semitic cartoons.
Right.
And his point was, if this is what they had published, a lot of those people in the streets in France would not be going around saying, I am Charlie, that kind of, tightly embracing the magazine that published them. And we've always had these codes, and I just don't think, I do think they do get out of hand. It is a slippery slope. They have downsides. I acknowledge that, and maybe I should be more alarmed than I am. And there are times when they are used to do what I think of as inhibiting speech, useful speech. But
I guess I would argue that universities are actually an exceptional case, because a university is where you are supposed to get an education. And you cannot have an education if the faculty is afraid to bring things up. Even if 60 years ago, you were not allowed to talk about pornography at Barnard College, that to me is a problem. It's something that we actually got over, and that was a good thing. And if we're slipping back to that, that's a bad thing. And education is an environment in which you learn to think through everything that comes your way. If you need to formulate an argument against a bad idea, you need to hear the bad idea. If you want to be confronted with, if you want your children to be confronted with ideas that they instinctively think are bad, but when they think about it harder, they realize are good, That too is a good educational experience. And if you're going to shut that kind of educational experience down, to whatever degree you shut it down, I think that's problematic, and I think that violates the mission of the university.
Okay, but again, I'm not against shutting down any expression of actual ideas. I'm against. I'm in favor of informal, not legal, but informal codes against slurs and things that actually I think impede the give and take about actual ideas. But I wanted. Yeah, go ahead.
Students going from your classroom, I know you teach a writing class. You would not.
No, I've never taught a writing class, but I've taught classes at Princeton and Penn. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I thought they were. But you would not feel chilled if students went directly from your classroom to somebody at, say, the Title IX office or the Student Diversity office or the administration to complain that you had used language which was triggering to them, traumatizing to them, or made them feel unsafe. That would not give you pause next time.
If it did, but if it happened, I might be bothered. But I'm actually pretty careful about words I use, and I have never noticed that care impeding me from saying something substantive that I wanted to say to the class. And I would say, that's the other thing, is these kids seem pretty tough to me. I mean, just last year at Princeton, I assigned something that, to read your piece, I would have thought could have gotten me in trouble. It was an excerpt from my book, The Moral Animal. It was just about male and female in the animal kingdom, with clear, by way of starting to explain differences between men and women that may have a biological basis. I can see that getting me into trouble. Nobody said anything. I didn't give them a trigger warning. Yeah. These kids actually don't seem very wimpy to me.
No, I don't think most kids are wimpy. I think there's a vocal minority, but I think that vocal minority is creating a problematic atmosphere on campus. As it happens, my Barnard students were amazing. I could have assigned that essay. They would have been fine. There would have been no problem. But I got scared, right? I got scared because other faculty members are scared, and they communicated their fear to me. And there's an atmosphere of fear. And I agree that most students are great. I mean, I love teaching, but there are a few who are going to walk out of your office and get you in trouble. And that, if you feel that the administration is receptive to that, if you feel that on the whole everyone on campus agrees with the student that words that are triggering or traumatizing should not be used, you're gonna think twice before you use them or assign that.
Okay. In closing, why don't you? I have a theory as to why there's more of the thing you're describing than there used to be. But okay. I will withhold it for now, or I can give it to you first. What order do you want to do this in? You have some theories.
Well, no. Tell me your theory.
My theory is part of it is just America becoming a more diverse society, or at least a more conspicuously diverse society. And we have traditionally used speech codes to manage diversity, right? I mean, with racism, anti-Semitism, and so on, we have had informal speech codes, and you see them kind of forming. I remember, again, you're probably too young for this, but when the Frito Bandito ad, Hispanic groups complained. I was into that. Not a huge loss for American culture, if you ask me. But anyway, that's the kind of thing we do to accommodate growing diversity. And I think what you've seen lately is two groups that were always there that have become visible. Rape victims are no longer ashamed to say they were raped. They have kind of come out of the closet because the stigma associated with rape has, I think, subsided happily. And gay people and transgender people and so on have come out of the closet. And I think a fair number of the examples you give have to do with those kind of minority groups, right? So I think in a way, part of what you're seeing is additional groups entering the kind of arena of diversity that we have traditionally managed with speech codes.
Yeah, I think I agree with you for the public domain. I think I don't agree with you for the university. So if I were a professor of, communications and I wanted to teach the Frito Bandito ad, would I get in trouble for teaching the Frito Bandito ad? I mean, I might worry about it. in the current atmosphere, I think you might say that's okay. And I don't think so. I think I would want to teach it. I might want to teach how it was reacted to. I might approve of the reaction, and I might approve of it being taken off the air, but I might get in trouble just for teaching it. And I think that's problematic. I think, rape victims should, if they need to avoid triggering situations, then perhaps they should. I'm Jewish. I grew up, I took classes on the Holocaust, right? I had more than half my extended family murdered in the Holocaust. I never needed a trigger warning to learn about what happened in the Holocaust, right? I never took the teaching of Mein Kampf as something that threatened me personally. I think it's necessary to teach and read Mein Kampf if you're going to understand the Nazi era. I mean, and the atrocities in the Holocaust are as bad as anything you can imagine. I mean, I think that educationally, you have to be willing to open yourself up to things that are threatening to you. And if there is a movement on campus, even if it's just the movement of a vocal minority, to invoke protections against feeling unsafe, I think that is going to damage the educational process, inhibit the educational process.
Okay, but you presumably, just to establish where exactly the bounds are, you presumably do approve of the kind of informal code that prevents any mainstream newspaper, pretty much any campus newspaper, from publishing a flagrantly anti-Semitic cartoon, and ensures that if they did publish it, there would be an uproar, right? I mean, is that that's and there are analogs to that in the case of African Americans and Hispanics and gay people and so on. And I just think it saves us.
I approve the uproar. I don't approve shutting the newspaper down, actually.
Well, that's not necessary. That's the beauty of informal codes. That's
right.
The thing. See, that's the thing. That's part of my thing is informal speech codes, in moral sanction, just moral sanction, not legal sanction, is what, in a way, protects the First Amendment. It's because in that realm we are effective in kind of discouraging the most inflammatory, damaging kind of speech. It's because we're so effective in that realm that the government doesn't have to get into the business. And so I see that as supportive of the First Amendment. Certain kinds of moral sanctions, certain kinds of speech codes.
I would just argue that it's spreading to a point where this idea of being vulnerable has this pernicious spreading effect. I think the rape culture instance is a really good one. I think Wendy McElroy has an excellent point, one that's really worth thinking about. We use the phrase rape culture kind of just instinctively as if everybody knows America has a rape culture. Well, maybe that we should be drawing a distinction between a nation that has a set of laws criminalizing rape and a culture that has a set of laws criminalizing rape and a culture in which, women are actually killed for letting themselves get raped. Maybe that really is a better use of the term. And we should recognize that we live in a society where it's criminalized and be grateful for that, even if it's not perfect. So why is that an impermissible form of speech? Or why is that so...
Well, nobody prohibited it. I mean, it happened on a college campus. And I think that's a debate that should happen. And in fact, if there's anything that you showed us in there that I was most concerned about, that I would have the most reservations about, it would probably be like setting up a competing talk.
Yeah.
It's like why don't you just have that talk the next day?
Right.
And let so I'm fine. I'm fine with the importance of expressing that substantive view.
Right. I actually do think that setting up the competing talk was shocking. And to make it worse, I didn't have room to report this. The president did not tell the organizers of the original event that she was doing that until she announced it in a mass email, which I think 4 days before the event, which I think was sort of insulting. They weren't some fly-by-night organization. This is a speakers forum group run out of the poli-sci department. Mm-hmm. And I thought it showed that the competing event was to present research showing that there is a rape culture. So taking the other side in the debate. So there were two people debating for Wendy McElroy, one in the room and one down the hall, and at the same time. And I thought that showed a flagrant disregard for the idea that we as that they as students should not be afraid of unpopular ideas. I thought she was really supporting the idea that some ideas just are unacceptable. Mm-hmm. And I don't think there are very many ideas that should be ruled unacceptable. I think there maybe are forms of hate speech that we should unofficially sanction, but I just don't think we should go around saying, drawing little lines around unpopular ideas and saying these are so unacceptable that we're going to create little safe spaces and we're going to have competing events. I agree with, I told you at the beginning, I'm not against safe spaces. I do think this safe space was quite ridiculous, but I'm not against safe spaces per se. I think they have their use. I'm against the idea that a campus should be a safe space, which, by the way, is the case in Canada. In Canada, several campuses on Canada have decided to declare themselves safe spaces, and there are a lot of people who are very upset about that because it means that there are certain ideas that just can't be discussed, like the legitimacy of gay marriage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that is pretty extreme. Okay, so that we've gone on longer than we almost ever do, but that's because this has been so interesting to me. Did you want to, in closing, say anything or trot out your theory as to why all of this is happening? Part of it's overindulgent parenting or something?
Well, I do think that's one theory. I was just sort of trotting out different people's theories. Mm-hmm. I do think that there is... Well, Judith Shapiro, the former president of Barnard, wrote a wonderful essay in which she says there's all these student services meant to ensure that students are healthy, are comfortable, feel safe, and they're creating an atmosphere in which a student comes to expect being sort of coddled. And she thinks, to say nothing of, I had this in the piece, but it had to get cut for room, to say nothing of adding an incredibly expensive layer of bureaucracy to universities. But she says students are being trained to think that they're entitled always to feel comfortable. And there's something good about being made to feel uncomfortable. It's not such a bad thing. It causes you to grow up. So that was one theory. I really think the main reason this sort of quasi-medicalized language of trauma and safety has become so popular is in response to, Title IX primarily, and also Title VI. In other words, it's a really good way to get the administration's attention.
Yeah. That was a very interesting part of your piece about how the wording of it's Title IX and Title VII, I think.
Title IX and Title VII. In retrospect, I should have said Title VI as well. Because Title VII really deals with employment, with workplaces. Title VI deals with discrimination on the basis of race or religion, and Title VII on the basis, Title IX on the basis of gender. So I actually there was an omission in my piece, which I have come to regret.
But that was interesting about how the wording of those makes kind of the hostile environment the avenue through which, if you were going to just try to suppress speech, not clear to me that that's what's going on in many of these cases, but if you were going to do that, that's your loophole.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting, which I didn't realize. Well, thanks so much. And after you write your next provocative piece, I may try to lure you onto Blogging Heads TV again, Judith.
Well, it's been a great conversation and very vigorous and robust debate, so thank you.
Yes. Blogging Heads is not a safe zone.
Oh, good.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.